Good morning. Today, Pastor Peter Chin will share the message from the book of John, chapter 4, verses 1 through 26. You can follow along on page 728 in the Pew Bibles in front of you or on the screen above. Hear the word of the Lord. Now, Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that he was gaining and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was not Jesus who baptized, but his disciples. So he left Judea and went back once more to Galilee. Now he had to go through Samaria, so he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot on the ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon. When a Samaritan woman came to draw water, Jesus said to her, "Will you give me a drink?" His disciples had gone into town to buy some food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" For Jews do not associate with Samaritans. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water." "Sir," the woman said, "you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" Jesus answered, "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." He told her, "Go, call your husband and come back." "I have no husband," she replied. Jesus said to her, "You are right when you say you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth." The woman said, I know the Messiah, called Christ, is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Then Jesus declared, "I, the one speaking to you, I am he." This is the word of the Lord.
One of the big things that we're doing in our church is this Saturday we're having our Justice and Spirituality conversation, where we're talking about faith and place. What role does place have in pursuing after Jesus? And one of the things we were really convicted about as a planning committee and as a staff was that we didn't want it to be just for people who go to conferences. And we all know those kinds of people, the people who register for everything, they read all the books, they're totally up to date on the latest kind of, conversations in faith and things like that. We welcome you if that describes you, but we also want it to be a place where everyone can come. Maybe if you're just feel like that's not a place you would usually go, and this is not something you usually know about, we really wanted everyone to come out there, which is why it's not just going to involve teaching, but there will be an interview with a congregation member. There'll be an art project that we're all going to participate in, and then finally a restaurant tour where we have actually connected with restaurants in the area, and they've agreed to host groups from our church. So at the end of the conversation, groups from our church will go to these restaurants, and they'll get a special meal that's provided by the owners, and the owner will actually sit down and tell us the story about how they got started and what it's like to have a restaurant in the area. And so really we're hoping no matter where you are in the spectrum, the conference spectrum, that you really feel like you can learn from this event. So again, sign-ups are outside. We encourage you to sign up today if you can, because it is on Saturday. There's childcare, and just hopefully you feel like it's something that's invited for all of you, or you're all invited to. Today's message is, I'm hoping will kind of lead into that, will whet our interest for that conversation, and it'll feel like it leads into it well. And this morning, what I wanted to talk about are the dividing walls of hostility, which is a phrase that Paul uses in Ephesians 2. And when he talks about that, he's talking about these different kind of animosities, hostilities that existed between Jews and other people. Right? And he's talking about how Jesus pulls them down. That's what he's talking about in Ephesians chapter 2. But there are several different ways that was expressed, hostilities that the Jews had with other people. And I wanted to talk about them a little bit each. The first was between Jews and non-Jewish people, Jews and Gentiles. That's specifically who's being referred to in Ephesians chapter 2. Right, that Jews were not supposed to be in the same room as Gentiles, as we see in Acts chapter 10, when Peter meets this Roman Gentile centurion, and his first response is not, "Hi, my name is Peter," it's, "I shouldn't be in this room with you." Right, that's the depth of that divide between Jews and non-Jewish people. So that's one of the dividing walls of hostility that Paul's talking about that existed during this time. Another is between Jews and Romans. The Romans had occupied Jerusalem. They didn't rule themselves. They had made it a Roman province called Judea. And by 70 AD, they would completely destroy the temple of Jerusalem. So that was another one of those dividing walls of hostility that existed during that time. The third one, I think, is the most interesting and probably the most overlooked, and that's between Jews and Samaritans. And out of all three of these dividing walls that Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2, this is the one that we know the least about, but is probably the sharpest. It's probably the most violent out of those three, actually. And so I think it's good for us to learn about it and to understand it a little more. So I wanted to go through the history of it so that we can understand why this was such a sharp and violent kind of conflict between these people. As I do that, as I go through this history, I just want to point out that the history of the Middle East, modern and ancient, is incredibly complex. So I am not going to say that I understand this completely, and I wouldn't be surprised if people had a very different interpretation of Middle Eastern history and politics. So just as this is what I've learned, this is what I know, but that this might be different from what some of us might have heard in our own lives. So the differences between Jews and Samaritans goes all the way back to the two kingdoms of Israel. And maybe some of you know that at one point, this one kingdom of Israel splits. It splits into a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. And they have different capitals. The capital of this northern kingdom is Samaria. You can kind of see where we get the word Samaritan from. The capital of the southern kingdom of Judah is called Jerusalem. And so we have these two kingdoms that are split, and they have very different understandings they don't get along, to be honest. That's why they split into these two kingdoms. But not only do they not get along, their histories begin to go in different ways as well. The kingdom of Israel would be conquered by a foreign power called Assyria. And after they were conquered by Assyria, what Assyria would do, they would colonize Israel. They would send people into Israel to live there and to marry with the people there. That was their plan of conquest, that they would colonize those places. So that's the history of the kingdom of Israel. That northern kingdom, people from Assyria and other Gentile groups would go there, and they would live there, and they would intermarry with the people of Israel. But the people of Judah, that southern kingdom, would have a very different history. They would be conquered by a foreign power as well, but a foreign power called Babylon, the Babylonians. And the Babylonians wouldn't colonize Judah. What they would do, you probably know, is they would exile Judah. They would take the people of Judah and they would transplant them to Babylon to become Babylonians, to be trained and encultured in what it meant to be Babylonians. So their histories became very different. They're both conquered, but they're conquered by different people. One of them is colonized and the other is exiled. After 70 years of exile, the people of Judah are allowed to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple walls, which is actually something that's opposed by the people who remain there, who are the Samaritans. Because of these different points of origin, northern and southern, and the different histories, they began to have very different opinions about what it meant to follow after God. They had different places of worship. For the Jews, the place of worship was always Jerusalem. But as we read in today's passage, for Samaritans, the place of worship was Mount Gerizim, different places where they felt were holy. They had different understandings of who were prophets and what books of the Bible you should read. For the Samaritans, the only prophet that they listened to was Moses. And the only books of the Bible that they really read were the Pentateuch, the first 5, nothing else. While the Jews had a broader selection of texts that they would read from. And so they began to develop different understandings of culture and theology and religion. And after a while, after generations of this, they began to really despise one another. And they would, in fact, try to kill one another whenever possible. In 128 BC, a Judean ruling class called the Hasmoneans would actually destroy the temple in Mount Gerizim. They would go to Samaritan territory, and they would destroy that temple. And then in response, later on, what the Samaritans would do is that they would take human bones and they would throw them into the temple in Jerusalem to defile it, so that people couldn't worship there on the Passover during the most important events. This was a very, very contentious, very hostile relationship between these two people groups, to the point whereby John 8:48, this is what we read, when the people of the Jews, meaning the people of Judah and Jerusalem, they're insulting Jesus, they're rejecting Jesus. This is how they do it in John chapter 8. They say, "Aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan and demon-possessed?" That's how they address him. In this time period, for Jews in the first century, being called a Samaritan was like a slur. It was being called a slur in our time, an insult, to be called that word. And I want you to keep that in mind as we progress through this story. But that's how hot this conflict was. These people couldn't stand each other. They were defiling the most holy places that they had. And in fact, they would sometimes kill one another. And that's the fact. This is a relationship that's really lost on us because many of us don't know the history that's here. But it's a very, very hostile relationship. But in addition to knowing how hostile this relationship is, what we should also know is that it was fully based out of geography. This is very much a conflict of location or of place. Think about where this story starts, where it begins, and where they begin to go in different places. It begins with geography. That there is this northern kingdom of Israel, and then there's a southern kingdom of Judah. So even the very beginning of their story is very much a geographical story. There's a northern component, there's a southern component. And then their experiences end up being geographical as well. That there is one group that is conquered, but then they're colonized. The other group is conquered and then exiled. Their experiences take geographical turns. There is a group that stays and is colonized. There is a group that has to leave and has to come back. So what they go through is ultimately an experience of geography, whether it's staying and being conquered, or they have to go to a place and they have to come back. The ways that they isolated, the ways that they began to push away from one another were not just in what they believed, it's in how they lived. It's in where they would live. It's in where they would worship. One of the ways that they would kind of hold each other at arm's length is to choose different locations for worship. Samaritans would say it's Mount Gerizim. This is the place of worship. While the Jews would say Jerusalem is the place of worship. The way they would despise each other was geographical. Even when they would travel at this time period, a really interesting aspect of history is that it was very dangerous to travel in this period. There were a lot of bandit groups that would, murder and kill people for their possessions. So when you wanted to travel, you would travel in straight lines, so you didn't have to extend that journey, and you would travel in the safest country possible because you didn't want to be robbed along the way. But what both Jews and Samaritans would do is that they would take these enormous arcs as they traveled to get around each other's territory. That if you were a Jew, you would arc around Samaria, even though you knew that was dangerous, even though you knew it would double the length of time that you were taking on a mule or on foot, you would do that to get around these people. And vice versa, that if a Samaritan wanted to come south, they would arc around Jerusalem because they didn't want to even be close to these people. Their hatred was not just something that they felt, it was something that they lived out with a map. It was a geographical kind of thing. Is that something that, again, we don't know? But this very hostile conflict between Jews and Samaritans was not just religious, it was not just theological, it wasn't just cultural, it was geographical. There was a place component to their hatred for one another. What I think this does, this illustrates a larger point that we as evangelicals often overlook, and that's this: that hostility between people is not just a matter of the heart. It is a matter of place, as divisions are created and sustained through geography and location. I think we have a tendency as evangelicals to believe that everything is a matter of the heart, of inside. Anything that's bad that's happening in the world is because our hearts are bad, because sin is there. And there's a good reason why we believe that. It's because Jesus taught us that. Jesus said that whether you're thinking about lusting after someone or you want to murder someone, it all begins here. And so there's a good reason why we think this way. But sometimes we don't recognize that what begins in the heart begins to take root in physical places and structures as well. That you may hate someone because of the color of their skin or their history or their culture, but you live that out in other more physical ways. And one of the physical ways that we do that is through place. It's through location. Just like we see in the story of the Jews and Samaritans. They don't just hate each other with their minds and with their hearts. They hate each other with their feet, with the places that they'll spend time with someone, where they will travel, where they will live, where they will not live. Geography is an expression of animosity. And this is not just the history of the Jews and the Samaritans that reflect this. It's our history. It's American history. You think about American history, we all know that there's a lot of prejudice. There's a lot of bigotry that we can find throughout our history. There's a lot of racism against First Nations people or against people who were brought here as slaves or against people who from Latin America or from Mexico. It doesn't really matter, but there's a lot of that we always find, a lot of prejudice, a lot of bigotry. And oftentimes when we think about that, not just as evangelicals, but as Americans, we think about our heart. We think about the hate that one person has for another. What we don't realize is how that hate is lived out. That more often than not, that hate that's in our heart gets lived out on a map. Think about how many different concepts of racism and prejudice in our country are actually geographical things. You think about things like sundown towns, that at one point in time, down Route 66, the American route, almost 50% of the counties of that area were sundown towns. Those were towns where they said to black people, don't be here after dark because you don't belong here. You don't belong here. Later on, this would extend to Japanese Americans in the middle of the 20th century. So this wasn't just hate. I hate you. I don't like you because of the color of your skin or the shape of your eyes or whatever it is. I hate you, so don't be in this place. Don't be within the town limits. So you see that this hatred was lived out really on a map. You think about redlining, racially restrictive covenants, these policies written into laws where people, usually black people, were not allowed to buy property in certain neighborhoods. Again, this is not just I don't like you and I don't like the color of your skin. It's I don't like you, I don't like the color of your skin, so don't be in my neighborhood. It's geography where it gets lived out. Think about segregation. One of the most, well-known understandings of prejudice in our country. It's geography. Don't be in this store. Don't be in this playground. Don't use this swimming pool. It's about place that these things get lived out. You think about internment. You make me afraid. I'm afraid you're going to attack our country. You look different from me. Go to that place away from me and stay there. We have to understand that so often the prejudice and bigotry, the animosity, the walls of hostility, both back in the first century and to this day, don't just stay here. They get lived out with our feet. They get lived out on maps. They get lived out in place with geography and locations. Even to this very day, I would challenge us to think about not just who we think we hate, because as modern Americans, we say we hate nobody, right? That's always going to be the answer. Ask yourself, who are you okay living next to? And where do you feel comfortable going? Right? That whole understanding of NIMBY, not in my backyard. That's where the rubber hits the road. It's location and place where we really discover who we're not comfortable with and where we don't think we should be going. But of course, as Christians, we don't live in that reality. We live in Ephesians chapter 2, where it tells us this: "For Jesus himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. He came and preached peace to you who are far away, and peace to those who are near, for through him we both have access to the Father by one Spirit." So here, we live in this very different reality that Jesus has given us, this good news. This good news is that because Jesus has died, he has crucified not just our sin in our hearts, he's crucified the dividing walls of hostility. Those are crucified on the cross. They're nailed to the cross. So we are no longer different groups set aside from one another, Jews and Gentiles, Samaritans, men, women, slave, and free. Because he pulled down those walls of hostility, we all have the same Father. And if we all have the same Father, guess what? We all have to be brothers and sisters. It automatically happens. That's what we read in Ephesians chapter 2. That because of what Jesus has done, the good news, part of it, is not just eternal life. It is the fact that we can actually look at a person, no matter where they're from, and say, "Hey, you're my brother because we got the same dad. We now have the same dad through Jesus Christ." This is the good news. And we live in this theological, spiritual, eternal reality. But what's really important for us to recognize about this reality, about this theological reality, is that Jesus didn't just live it theologically. He didn't just say, "Oh, I believe this in my mind." He would live it out with his feet. He would live it out with his location and where he would go. And we read that in today's passage where it says this: "Now he had to go through Samaria, but he came to a town in Samaria called Sychar, near the plot of ground Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus, tired as he was from the journey, sat down by the well. It was about noon when a Samaritan woman came to draw water. Jesus spoke with her and said, 'Will you give me a drink?' The Samaritan woman said to him, 'You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?'" What's important to point out about this is, again, this makes sense to some degree because Jesus, pulled down these dividing walls of hostility. Surely, of all people, Jesus, when he sees a Samaritan person, isn't going to hate them. He sees someone that he loves. But he doesn't just think about it up here. He'll live it out with his feet. He doesn't just say, "Oh, I'm okay with all Samaritan people. I love all Samaritan people. I am Samaritan blind. I'm good with everything." He will go to Samaria. That sense of the dividing walls of hostility will be lived out with his location. In the same way that the dividing walls of hostility were lived out by location, so reconciliation will be lived out by him going to that place. Jesus' spiritual work of reconciliation didn't just exist up here and here. It shaped where he would go and who he would interact with there. It was lived out on a map. Again, this is not just something that Jesus would do. He would command people to do as well. In Luke chapter 10, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, there is this man who is beat and robbed on the side of the road, and as he is lying there, two Jewish officials pass him by because they don't want to be bothered or made unclean by dealing with what might be a dead body. But then Jesus goes on to say, "But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." A couple of things that I want to point out about the parable of the Good Samaritan. First off, we don't understand how scandalous this would be. Because again, we don't understand that Samaritan, that word Samaritan was a slur. It was a racial, ethnic slur that people would use. We hear the Good Samaritan. We've heard that our entire lives. I bet you 90% of us have done a coloring sheet or we've colored in the Good Samaritan. So we don't get the import of what's being said here. What he's saying here is a slur to the ones who are listening. So when we hear it, what we should be hearing verbally is this. These two Jewish officials pass him by. But a Samaritan came and stopped. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, stopped and bandaged this man's wounds. And we know this is the case because look at the expert in the law, his response. What does he say when Jesus says, who is the neighbor here? He doesn't even call the Samaritan by name. Do you realize that? He doesn't say, oh, it was a Samaritan. You know why? Because it's a bad word. So what does he say instead? He says, the one who had mercy. He's so deeply enculturated in this hatred for Samaritans, he can't even bring himself to say that it was the Samaritan who had mercy. Instead, he says, it's the one who had mercy. Because that's how scandalous this teaching was. The other thing we should recognize about the parable of the Good Samaritan is that this is not an illustration, it's a command. Sometimes in parables, what Jesus is doing, he's illustrating something we can't understand. Something that's too much for us. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast. The kingdom of heaven is like this. The parable of the Good Samaritan is actually not that. He's not saying the ministry of reconciliation is like this thing. He's saying you should go and do this. You should go to the other side of the road and go and spend time with the wrong kind of person. So we have to understand that for Jesus, this reconciled life, this life where the dividing walls of hostility were pulled down, was something that we go somewhere. Not just we know something, but we go somewhere with. And there's no clearer place where we see that but in Acts chapter 1 as well, where Jesus again is giving instructions to the disciples. Kind of the second part of the Great Commission reads this. It is not for you to know the times or dates the Father has set by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And again, we have to recognize, we've heard this before, but this is a scandalous instruction where he's saying, go to exactly the wrong place. Because I have risen from the dead, because I have dismantled these dividing walls of hostility, he doesn't just say, know it up here. Make sure you've got your Bible catechism all right. He says, go to Samaria now, because I have destroyed the dividing walls of hostility. This was something that Jesus didn't just do and accomplish. It was something that we had to go somewhere. It wasn't just knowledge, it was placement and location where reconciliation gets lived out. What I want us to understand is that reconciliation is not just an idea. It's not just an emotion. It is a conviction which is lived out by our feet. It's lived out by where we live and where we go and whom we spend our time with there. That's reconciliation. You don't get reconciliation when you can write it down, when you've read the right books. You get reconciliation when your feet reflect reconciliation, when the maps of your life and your investments reflect reconciliation. When you go, that's where reconciliation really hits the road. And that's exactly what I found out as well, that I didn't truly understand reconciliation until I went to Samaria. I'm going to close with this final illustration, but after I graduated from seminary, I would say that I was pretty well versed in this ministry of reconciliation, the dismantling of the dividing walls of hostility. I had learned about it. I had read multiple texts about it. I could have and might have preached a few sermons on it by then. Well versed. And so I could have regurgitated any one of these facts. But I would say that deep in my heart, it was just something that I knew. It was something that I could quote, and I could say, this person would say that person would say this. Reconciliation for me, this understanding that God has truly done this work of pulling down these walls of hatred, never came alive until I went to Samaria. And for me, Samaria is not the northern part of Jerusalem or Israel. It was the inner city of D.C., because that's not where Korean Americans are supposed to go. That's Korean Samaria. And I'm going to generalize here very broadly, but for the most part, growing up, and I think I've heard this from many from many first-generation, second-generation Koreans, you don't go to the inner city to live. You go there to work. You can go there to have a business, to take money, but you don't go there to raise kids, right? And that's always been a weird thing for me, that how can you take money from somewhere but not put money into that place? They say, don't go there. You shouldn't live there. People don't want you there. They don't like you. And, you should go to a better school district. So for Koreans, Samaria, that place where you don't go, where you don't want to be there, for me, ultimately, that was a place like the east side of D.C., Anacostia, places like that. And so for me, reconciliation never really became a reality until I felt called to go there, until I lived in a neighborhood that was 99% African American except for this one random Korean family living on a corner. And it never became a reality until I pastored in places like Anacostia. And when I went to Samaria, when my feet would go there, not when I read the right books, not when I got an A on my exams, and when my feet reflected reconciliation and I was in Samaria, that's when I began to realize that reconciliation is not an idea. It's not a theological concept. It is the very power of God at work. God's full authority is behind this work. He will throw down hard for the work of reconciliation. And I didn't learn that in Fuller. I didn't learn that through a book by paging through something. I learned that when my feet were on the ground somewhere that I should not have been, where I should have been experiencing hostility and hatred, but instead I saw the very power of God, that's where I began to realize this. That's where reconciliation becomes alive for all of us. It's not because I'm yelling at you, and I apologize if I'm yelling. I'll tone it down just a little bit. Sorry, it happens sometimes. But you don't get reconciliation because I do this. You get reconciliation because of where your feet go. It's something gets lived out with your very presence and with your location. That if you really want to pursue and understand reconciliation, don't think about what you know. Don't think about how broad your depth is or your knowledge is, all those kind of things. Think about where you are. Think about the places that you go. Think about who you want around you and whom you spend time with. That's reconciliation. It is a tangible, meaty, geographic concept. That's where reconciliation truly becomes reality when we think about Samaria in our lives. That's why I think it's so appropriate that we celebrate the Lord's Supper today, because the Lord's Supper is very much a reflection of that idea. That we all know that Jesus loves us, we know that Jesus gives us new life, but the body and the blood, the bread and the wine, what they represent is the physicality of it. That Jesus' love is not just a feeling. It was a body that was broken. It was blood that was spilled. There was a tangible quality to the things of God and the gifts of God and the work of God. And so as we take of this physical thing today, may we be reminded about the physical ways in which we live out our calling as well. I want to thank Eric Zimmerman for breaking this bread and contributing to this sacrament this morning. On the night Jesus was betrayed, he took the bread, and after giving thanks, he broke it, saying, "This is my body, which is broken for each of you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, This is a new covenant which is in my blood. In my blood. Do this, however often you drink of it, in remembrance of me. For whenever we eat of this bread or we drink of this cup, we are celebrating the Lord's death until he returns again. I'm going to ask the worship team and those who are serving the elements to come up first. For the rest of us, why don't we just bow our heads in a moment of prayer and preparation to receive this physical thing as a reminder of what Jesus has physically done for all of us.